They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and that statement is no different in the world of wrestling. After all, who was Ric Flair if not a take on Nature Boy Buddy Rogers? And if it wasn't for someone like Terry Funk, we may have never had Jon Moxley. That said, these are far from the only modern-day versions of classic performers out there. No, there are hundreds in fact. But who are the best of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Carrying the Mantle, legendary wrestlers' modern-day counterparts. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with one of the most obvious examples of this, and that's the similarities between Kurt Angle and Gamel Stevenson. Yes, it's that old familiar tale. Take an Olympic gold medalist in amateur wrestling, sign him up to a contract with WWE, then unleash him out there into the squared circle. Okay, maybe it's not that familiar, as prior to Stevenson signing in 2021, Kurt Angle was pretty much in a class of his own when it came to a pro wrestler who had legit skills no one else could match. Really, the only other person who could stand up to him was Brock Lesnar, but even the Beast ultimately paled in comparison to the Pittsburgh native, as after only a few years in the ring, he was already being heralded as one of the greatest of all time. So obviously then, this meant when another Olympic athlete inevitably joined the New York promotion at some point down the line, they were going to have big shoes to fill. And that's where Gamel Stevenson comes into the picture, as following a gold medal win in freestyle wrestling at the 2020 Summer Olympic Games, he began expressing his interest in joining the world of the pros too. Obviously then, this led to a lot of excitement, and it wasn't long before Vince McMahon had formally got him to sign on the dotted line. Still, even if the Idaho native was now under contract, he'd have to prove he was worth the hype. Would he do this? Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, because in his debut match against Baron Corbin at NXT's The Great American Bash in July of 2021, he failed to impress the live crowd in attendance, with this leading to them vocally turning on him. But that doesn't mean all is lost for Gamel, as, with him still only having had one bout, there's every possibility he'll improve as time goes on. And if he does to even half the level that Kurt Angle did, he'll surely be a top guy for years to come in WWE and a future world champion multiple times over. That said, he's not the only person currently on the developmental brand who's looking to make a splash by drawing more than a little inspiration from a prominent figure of the past. No, over in the women's division in fact, Cora Jade is channeling AJ Lee in the hopes it'll take her all the way to the top. Yes, prior to the women's revolution in WWE during the mid-2010s, there were only really two performers who were keeping the division afloat, with those being Paige and AJ Lee. And while the former certainly made her mark too, you could argue it's the latter who ultimately became the bigger star in WWE, as not only could she go in the ring, but she was excellent at promo and character work as well. Hell, at one point AJ was being featured so prominently on WWE TV, she was regularly appearing in main event segments as the on-screen general manager of Raw. And it was this success which inspired a whole other generation of young girls to follow in her footsteps. And of these girls, the one who's perhaps come the closest to living up to what she left behind so far is Cora Jade, as since joining the NXT roster in 2021, she's undergone a meteoric rise which has seen her become a one-time NXT Women's Tag Team Champion and a pillar of the division overall. How has she done this? Well, mostly by taking from her hero wherever she can. That's right, looking at the two side by side with their tomboy aesthetic and similar fighting style, it's not hard to see how one inspired the other. The only question left then is, will Cora Jade be able to match up to how well AJ did on the main roster once she inevitably joins it? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. One person we won't have to adopt a wait and see attitude towards regarding their success on a larger stage though is our next subject. And that's because, taking a page out of the Book of China, Rhea Ripley has become one of the fastest rising stars in all of wrestling as of late. That's right, you could make a solid argument that this Australian-born star has become the biggest name the division has to offer over the last year or so. And the way she's done this has been to tower over every other woman around her, both physically and emotionally. Seriously, at this point, Rhea seems like such an imposing figure, it's hard to imagine anyone else beating her. Hell, we honestly wouldn't be surprised to see her take on a good portion of the men and win. Of course, she's not the first woman on the WWE roster to hold such an aura, however, as back at the turn of the millennium, Chyna was doing the exact same thing. In fact, she was going a step further by actually beating the men, with this leading to her becoming a two-time Intercontinental Champion. The only problem was she was so good in this role that after the ninth wonder of the world left the industry behind, no one could really pick up the mantle. Sure, some like Beth Phoenix or Awesome Kong may have tried, but none of them were ever able to reach the same level. So it's just as well Rhea Ripley came along when she did then, as for the first time now, it feels like there's a true successor to what Joni Laurer was doing back in the 90s. And with the current women's world champion still only being 26 years of age, she's potentially got decades to continue building on this legacy and maybe even exceed it. Sure, it doesn't seem likely she'll be challenging for any male titles in the immediate future given the PG nature of the current product, but then stranger things have happened. And if she does manage to do this, who's to say she won't be the first woman in the company to become a men's world champion? That said, it's also equally as likely she'll go for one of the mid-card belts too. Maybe the one which was until very recently held by our next subject, Austin Theory. And the reason he's our next subject for this video is because with all his early success, some have gone as far as to compare him to a modern-day version of John Cena. Now we know this is a controversial statement for many fans, as to put Austin Theory on the level of the biggest star of his era seems like a stretch. But if you think about it, the two do have a lot of similarities to their career thus far. Yes, like with Big Match John, Theory has been accused of getting pushed too hard too fast, and this has even led to a section of the fan base resenting him for it. On top of that, both early Cena and his current day counterpart have been criticized for being a little one-note, with the comments about the 16-time champ back in the early 2000s often centering around his lack of in-ring skills, and the criticism around Theory usually coming in the form of his perceived lack of character depth. But despite such criticisms, it's undeniable both have been successful anyway, as since joining the main roster full-time in 2021, the 26-year-old Georgia native has risen fast. Hell, at one point he was even given the distinction of being the new on-screen protege to Vince McMahon, with this letting everyone know just how much the boss saw in him. And as if that wasn't enough, he's helped to reinvigorate the United States title once more by holding on to it for a total of 258 days. See a pattern here? Yeah, it's all pretty similar to the way John Cena was pushed back at the beginning of the Ruthless Aggression era, up to and including the lengthy US title run. Of course, whether or not Theory will be able to match his main event level success remains to be seen, but if what he's done so far has given us any indication, we wouldn't be surprised to see him holding a world championship before long. And he's not the only one we expect to see with main event level gold around their waist at some point in the near future. Though in the case of Darby Allin, it'll be in AEW instead of WWE, the very place where he's currently proving himself to be a modern-day Jeff Hardy. Yes, as it stands today, Darby Allin is the resident daredevil of AEW. It doesn't matter if he's crashing down onto thumbtacks, getting stuffed in a body bag then thrown backwards out of the ring, or doing any number of other countless death-defying stunts, watching him perform is like watching a man with a death wish. But then any fans of the Attitude Era will already be familiar with seeing such things anyway, as back then it was Jeff Hardy who filled such a role with his often insane high-risk offense. So little regard did the North Carolinian seem to have for his own body at times that most assumed he'd be crippled by the time he was 30. Against all odds though, he didn't end up crippling himself, and is in fact still an active performer today for All Elite Wrestling. And it's there he's been able to pass the torch somewhat to his Seattle-born counterpart, particularly during the wild singles bout the two had on the November 5th episode of Dynamite in 2022. The only question left then is, once Jeff Hardy finally decides he can take no more and hangs up his boots once and for all, how much longer will Darby be behind him? Will he, like his hero, continue to defy medical science and keep going the way he's going for decades yet? Or will he crash and burn before he can ever hit his peak? If we're taking a guess, we'd say we're cautiously optimistic it'll be the former rather than the latter, and we've no doubt that if he keeps going, he'll be a multiple-time world champion before he's done, with him perhaps even being the man to dethrone MJF. And what a moment of vindication that'll be if it comes, because with so many people early on in his career saying he didn't have what it took to be a top guy, Darby will surely love nothing more than to prove them wrong. But he's not the only person in AEW who's looking to prove he's the best. No, over in the tag team division, there's a pair who are currently staking their claim to being arguably the best of their generation themselves. That said, FTR will freely admit they took a lot of what makes them great from the brainbusters before them. Given that Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard have both worked for the Jacksonville-based company over the years, however, and given the fact that the latter was actually their manager for a while, we are sure the 80s powerhouses don't mind the imitation. No, they're likely more than happy that someone is carrying on where they left off, because they were always about putting on great wrestling matches above all else. And let's not mince words here. When it comes to putting on great matches, there are few better in the world than Dax Harwood and Cash Wheeler today. And what makes their achievements all the better is that they've been able to go against the grain of modern high-flying wrestling in doing so by bringing things back to a very territory-era style. Honestly, if you were to place FTR in the 70s or 80s, they wouldn't look out of place, as their work fits in so perfectly with what teams like the Brainbusters were doing back then. What was that style? Make it look as real as you possibly can. And that meant picking a body part, working on it, and using this to wear your opponents down. Then, once your opponent has been worn down, use your tag team expertise to cut the ring off and go for the kill shot. It was a method which led to Arn and Tully becoming 3-time World Tag Team Champions back in their heyday, and using that same method, FTR have been able to exceed even this by holding on to Major Gold a total of 8 times across countries as far and wide as America, Mexico, and Japan. What further successes will the future hold for them then? Well, that all depends on how long they choose to go on for at this point, as by the time all's said and done, they'll probably have far exceeded the team who inspired them so much. Not that the Brainbusters should be sad about this though. No, the very fact that they are still influencing the industry so much should be a badge of honor they wear proudly, just as the fact that Shawn Michaels has been able to serve as such an inspiration for one of the best out there today, Seth Rollins, should be something he holds dearly. That's right, just as the Heartbreak Kid, along with Bret Hart of course, largely carried the WWF in-ring product during the mid-90s, today you could argue that baton has been picked up by the Architect. And we're not suggesting there are no other good wrestlers on Monday or Friday nights by saying this, but what we are saying is that few, if any there, are on Seth's level. Honestly, there's a reason why when Triple H decided to crown a new World Heavyweight Champion in 2023 and have them serve as the workhorse of the company, someone who could be relied on to have great matches week in and week out, he went with the Iowa native. After all, with his high-flying, innovative style, there really was no better choice. And that mirrors exactly what happened with Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels during the New Generation era as it happened, because back then, with business in the toilet, the boss knew he needed to get the belt on someone special if he wanted to drum up fan interest. So he went with the most spectacular star on his roster, someone who was doing things no one else could do. And while this may not have turned business around, it did at least give us some of the best bouts of the era. In fact, so good was Shawn during this period, there was a question as to whether anyone would ever be able to match up to him. Fast forward a few decades though, and Seth Rollins is doing just this by raising the bar every time he hits the ring. Hell, if you really wanted to, you could argue he's actually better than the 4-time world champion at this point. Yes, we know that last statement is very much up for debate, but the fact that we can even talk about the two men's level of talent in the same breath shows just how much of a top-level player Rollins really is. And given he's still in his prime, who knows how much higher he'll rise in the future? Maybe he'll go to places even HBK never could have dreamed of. One place he won't be able to go, though, is the surreal and spooky side of the industry, and that's because this has been reserved for the likes of The Undertaker and his own modern-day counterpart, Bray Wyatt. Now, we know it might sound like sacrilege to compare anyone to the dead man and suggest they could even come close to filling his shoes, but if there exists any performer in the modern day who could take up the role, it's Bray Wyatt. And that's because with his hugely creative mind, he's been able to create some of the most out there cinematic moments the industry has ever seen. But then that's exactly what Mark Calloway was doing from the 90s onwards too, as let's not forget, his was never a character based around realism. No, instead his was a gimmick which would see him die, ascend to the heavens, and return to life again all in short order on a semi-regular basis. And when he wasn't doing that, he was also taking part in some crazy telenovela-style storylines, such as that which he had with his long-lost brother Kane. Sure, it might have seemed wacky on the face of things, but the Texan was able to commit to things so fully that it always worked. And luckily then, this is the same dedication Bray Wyatt has shown over the course of his run too. Seriously, it doesn't matter if he's playing a backwoods cult leader intent on bringing the entire WWE under his thumb, or a children's TV host turned horror movie monster who only wants people to let him in. He always sells the story as if it's completely real. Perhaps it should come as no surprise then that he's been able to maintain such a devoted fan base, and that even The Undertaker himself seems to be a fan of what he's doing. Seriously, according to interviews with the Phenom, he sees a lot in Bray, and believes he could very well be the one to take up his role as the resident spooky figure of the industry going forward. And if he believes this, then we're certainly not going to argue with him, just as we won't argue with anyone who feels like our next subject, Matt Riddle, is basically a modern-day version of Rob Van Dam. Yes, it's true that RVD and Matt Riddle both like the same recreational activities, but the similarities between the two go way further than this. After all, each also uses an innovative martial arts-based style in the ring, one which has helped them to find much success. On top of that, their easygoing characters have seen them become hits with fans across the world. And as if that wasn't enough, they're each just as skilled at mat-based encounters as they are at taking part in high-flying ones. But then this latter fact should come as no surprise for fans of Riddle, as he first got his start in the world of combat sports via his time in MMA. Yes, while fighting for the likes of UFC and Bellator, the Las Vegas native was able to obtain an impressive 8-3-2 record in the octagon. That said, as time went on, he began feeling the pull to try something new, and this was exactly what led him to first start dipping his toes into the world of pro wrestling in 2014. Cut to 4 years later, and he'd signed with WWE, where, now with a whole new level of spotlight on him, he was able to show off his skills to the larger world for the first time. And it was at this point the RVD comparisons first started pouring in as, like with Riddle, Van Dam also first got exposure during the early 90s for pioneering a martial arts style which seemed to be inspired by the work of his namesake, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Hell, so unique was the Michigan native's moveset back then that before long he'd pretty much become the star attraction of Paul Heyman's Renegade ECW promotion. And when that company folded in 2001 and Rob moved over to the WWE instead, he was able to shine just as bright there on account of the fact that no one else was doing it quite like him. But it isn't as if he's quite done with wrestling yet. No, only recently he was taking on Jungle Boy on an episode of Dynamite. So there remains every possibility that before all is said and done, RVD and Matt Riddle might actually meet in the ring. And if they do, we'll get a chance to see who truly is the best. Of course, they're not the only legend and modern-day counterpart that this could still happen with, because when it comes to our next subject, Grayson Waller, his biggest inspiration, The Miz, actually shares the same roster with him, even if they are separated by brands at the moment. As we all know though, the WWE brand extensions rules are loose at best, and so there's every possibility the two will clash before long. And what makes this one even more interesting is that it doesn't even have to be a match we see here pitting them against one another. No, we'd be just as happy with a promo battle, as with the two's strongest points being their mic work, that would likely be more entertaining than any one-on-one encounter could ever be. Sure, an actual match might be fun too under the right circumstances, as both can go when forced to, something Waller has shown throughout his time on NXT, and something The Miz has proven over the years as well. And that's not even the end of the similarities between the pair either as it happens, because perhaps unsurprisingly given their in-ring characters, each also made a splash outside of the squared circle by appearing on reality TV. That's right, years after Mike Mizanin first made his name on MTV's The Real World, Grayson Waller was following in his footsteps by appearing on Australian Survivor. And while he wouldn't win this show, he did gain enough notoriety through it to where he was able to further his wrestling career to the point he could travel over to America. And it's just as well he did this because once he arrived there in 2021, it quickly became apparent he not only had the gift of gab, but also the ability to carry himself during matches. Will he be able to achieve the same level of success his American counterpart has done by the time things are over? We're gonna say there's a pretty good chance of that, as Vince McMahon has always been one to prize larger-than-life characters above all else. But then each of the people we've discussed today, at least the WWE contracted ones, have done enough to capture the boss's attention. And that's exactly why all of them have earned their spot as the rightful heirs to the legacy of the person who came before them.